So I will get going. We have a lot of ground I want to cover today, and the first things will be a bit about the formalities. So people will have a few minutes to join in, but I think we'll just get started already. So first of all, welcome to this session on Unpacking ERP. Nice of you to join in. I will do questions after the session, but I have the chat going, and then yes, Alexander, I can see that you are joining in. You feel free to ask questions during the session, but I'll try to answer them afterwards. I might answer something if I see it and can respond to it quickly, but otherwise we'll have a Q&A afterwards. This recording of the live stream will be sent to you afterwards and will be available on Netcompany's YouTube channel. And my webcam is rather big in compared to the entire live stream. So let me know if I'm in the way of something because I can't really see that easily. So then I can turn it off and you can see it. So let's first of all talk a bit about the purpose. Why are we gathered in this talk? What will you learn from this one? I would like to unpack and expand upon the idea of ERP, and what I mean by that is discussing what is ERP and also providing some nuance to the idea of what ERP can be, and then afterwards we'll always also talk about contextualizing different ways to approach ERP. So the agenda for today looks like this. Quite simple, with starting out with a framework. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I first had some some thoughts. I felt the urge to dive right into all the technologies that you can use. But I think for some people it's not very clear what ERP is, and then my second thought was, how on earth do I cover as broad a topic as ERP? So what I want to do in this session is instead to go through sort of like a funnel, starting with the very broad strokes of ERP, and then slowly get into the nitty gritty of ERP. And the idea is that we first establish a way of thinking about ERP, sort of the framework, and then we dive into implementing ERP, and then we get ever more granular, and I'll end up with a specific Business Central demo, which is the ERP system that I've been working with. Now I know I tend to explain things in rather abstract ways, so I also wanted to force myself to increasingly become a bit more specific. So this is exactly what I mean by first unpacking and then expanding upon the idea of ERP, and then contextualizing these approaches to ERP, all the way from defining ERP, talking about system architectures, different ways of having ERP delivery organizations, and then Business Central, as I mentioned. So a bit about me. Okay, so I see someone thinks that I'm muted. I think you should hear me. Let me know if you can't, but there is a bit of delay on the live stream, so it may be the reason why you think I may be muted. But yeah. Okay, so about me, a bit about me, so you know who's talking to you, and so you know that you can take everything with a grain of salt. So my name is Thomas Tarp. I'm a senior consultant at Netcompany and based in Copenhagen, where most of our ERP department is. We also have people in Warsaw, in Poland, and in Aarhus in Denmark. Now I have 2 years of ERP experience with the Business Central platform, which was previously called NAV. Now this talk is mostly going to be about the observations that I have made during my time in ERP. I don't claim to be an expert because I haven't been in the game for that long, and usually when I hear talks about ERP, people are like, yeah, I've worked with Navision for 10, 30 years, even sometimes, and there's some people who have been in the game for a long time. But I think I have some valuable ideas about ERP that I want to share, and also during my preparation for this talk, I've consolidated many of my ideas. My educational background is in business. I've studied strategy, organization, and leadership at Copenhagen Business School, and the way I like to think about it is that it's sociology in a business context. So it's all about the people in an organization, and that's very relevant for implementing a technology like an ERP system is. And it has mostly given me the toolbox of questioning everything, not always providing a lot of answers, but I will try to provide some answers as well today. And our caveat before we begin, I do come from academia, so I feel like it is relevant to mention that what I will be talking about is going to be my experiences, opinions, and not necessarily rigorously studied things. But I hope you'll gain something from it, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards, get feedback, and even discuss topics with you. You can find my email on the first part of the presentation on the initial slide. And lastly, my interests are in climbing, board sports, and taekwondo. I love doing sports, so that is what I spend my spare time doing. Okay, but let's dive in. So ERP, what is it? It's an acronym for Enterprise Resource Planning, and it's a bit of a misguiding name because it's not only about planning. It's not only about resources. It is about enterprises, if you take it in the broad sense of the word. So there is that. But the reason why I'm starting out with the name is because it can be a bit confusing. And my main problem is that it implies a certain paradigm of business thinking, which is the planning perspective. So I actually want to continue from there. The term ERP was first used by a Gartner group in 1990, as far as I could find on the interwebs, as an extension of what's called MRP, Material Requirements Planning, which is really how to plan for how much you need to order for your production or sales and these types of things. It also originated with a lot of accounting systems being created in the 1980s, some before that even, but it accelerated and got a lot better in the 1980s, and then they became ERP systems later on when they could do a lot more than just accounting. Now, this business paradigm the planning perspective, it's based on these assumptions that you can plan your business's future and that you can plan it in these scheduled periods. Every year you have a plan and so on and so forth, and also that you can do so by allocating limited resources. And it's a bit of an old school way of thinking about business today. So I want to provide just a bit of critique about this perspective. First of all, it's questionable how much of a business strategy that is as actually planned as opposed to emerging from the organization. For example, the culture and a champion coming up with an idea, or the CEO just watching something on the news and getting a good idea. All of these things. So it's very emergent in reality, and also you have influences from outside the organization's control, and these things that determine what the strategy in the end does look like. Another point is that businesses are changing ever more rapidly, and it becomes harder and harder to actually plan for a longer term. And you have also lines between markets and industries that are being blurred, and new ones are created fast. And you also don't have resources that are always limited, because you have a zero margin digital world. So if you have digital products, for example, but you also have open innovation, online communities. If you're a developer, you probably know Stack Overflow and get help from there. That can be a type of resource, an intellectual resource that you bring into an organization. So as you can probably already tell by now, I'm trained to question things, but the reason why I'm doing is to unpack and expand upon ERP. But we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. So later we'll talk about some new approaches to ERP, and also a new model from Gartner Group, and we'll get into that a bit later. I want to start out by talking about a conceptual split. Okay, I see. Thanks, Johan. I see that the webcam is covering quite a bit of the slideshow. I'll remove it for the next slide where it matters a bit more. Okay. I also see a question that if it's possible to receive the presentation afterwards, I'll make sure you can receive it. Yes. Okay. So this conceptual split, I would like to just first of all talk about ERP systems as business systems, and I want to talk about ERP systems as IT systems. And what I mean by that is that business systems are the functional areas that are covered by ERP, and then you have the IT systems as the ones that actually fulfill those functional areas. And we have very nice cleaning stuff in the background here. Um, and the reason why I want to make the split is because there is the history of ERP, and then there is ERP today. And ERP is not just one big and clunky system anymore, and it will become a bit more apparent why this distinction is relevant later on. So it's mostly to keep the concept of ERP alive and evolving. Um, and this conceptual split is also, in my opinion, what makes ERP quite exciting, because it's exactly at the interface between critical business processes and the IT implementations of those processes. So, there can sometimes be some assumptions made by IT people and business people. For example, have the Silicon Valley attitude that business stuff is just a secondary issue to solve when the tech is in place, and you have perhaps the business people attitude that only a few years back you saw all these strategy reports and slideshows with the digital strategy as bullet points and so on, almost like a footnote in the larger strategy. And I think today people are realizing that the IT systems and the IT infrastructure are at the heart of the business, and that's a critical distinction. So um, in ERP, business and IT really come together and are very intertwined, and both parts need to be considered carefully in relation to one another. Now, this is a very messy slide, and it's a bit on purpose, because if you Google ERP, you'll get tons of very pretty models showing what ERP covers. But the exact lines in practice are very blurry. You have very many different systems that can do very different things, and it's as you all can also see, it's quite a lot. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and there are many overlaps between these areas. It's really all about how you slice the cake. And of course, some of these bullets are bigger than others, and each one can look very different in different companies and sizes of companies. So I just want to point out a few of these. So you have finance and accounting, which is really at the core of any ERP system, I would say. And then you also have order processing with both purchase and sales. You have master data management. You have your customers, items, and vendors, and so on in the system. You have project management, HR. You also have supply chain management, a big one, where you can manage the movement of items and so on. And service production, manufacturing specific functionality, and these things. So quite a lot can be covered by an ERP system. And later we'll get into some of the implications it has for an IT vendor trying to deliver such a complex system. Now, let me just from now on remove my now you should only be able to see my screen. So I want to talk a bit about defining ERP, or talking about the scope of ERP. And the way I look at it is that the goal of an ERP system is to support core business processes. So the ones that I outlined just before. And I don't mean core IT products. I don't mean like a Netflix or Facebook or Google where the IT system is the business itself. And I don't mean IT person for usages like other than business. So for example, graphics software, or to go a bit meta, software development software, and these things. What I mean is really core processes that all businesses have, as outlined in the functional areas, which are typically covered by an ERP system. But it's not too important how you slice the cake, because it is very individual for each organization anyway. Another thing is that the implementation of an ERP system should be independent from its definition. So by this I mean that an ERP system is best implemented or viewed through the lens of those who need to use the ERP system, rather than say the vendor or the software developer, say Microsoft or SAP or something like that, saying this is what an ERP system is. It really needs to come from the organization that needs the ERP system. And just one funny thing about this way of looking at ERP is that any business really has an ERP system, whether they want to or not. So if you do all your accounting in physical ledgers, that is part of your ERP system, because you think about it as the technologies deployed to support those core business processes. And also these functional areas outlined before, they may be changing over time. So I really argue for a dynamic and changing perspective on what ERP is. And this definition allows for that, although some may argue that it overextends the relevance of ERP, but that's also why I would prefer to have a different name for ERP. So let's talk a bit about this model. This is the model that I was talking about earlier, that Gartner Group has also made. It's called the Pace Layered Application Strategy, and what this is really that it divides the portfolio of applications that you have into 3-layer systems of innovation, systems of differentiation, and systems of record. And the reason why you do that is that it's different paces for each type of application. So if you have a system of record, it needs to be very stable, robust, and often needs to live up to regulation. When you have systems of differentiation, they are very unique to the specific organization and their unique capabilities and their competitive advantages business-wise. And then you have systems of innovation where you have to adapt very quickly and be very flexible to deploy IT systems on a short notice. And the reason why I'm bringing this one up is because it can be very useful to categorize the portfolio of applications and strategize differently about them. So you have different governance for each type of application. And as you saw before, an ERP system covers a lot of ground, and so it can be considered an application portfolio of sorts. We'll talk more about that a bit later, but if you think about each functional area as something that should be placed in this model, it covers a bit of some different layers and in different ways. So I think that's a relevant level of analysis. Now, how do we then actually place an ERP system on this model? First of all, the short answer to this is that it's mostly a system of record. It's covering core transactions and processes, and if you take accounting, for example, that's definitely a system of record. It needs to be stable and robust, and it's regulated. And we don't want too much creative accounting. That can definitely get us in trouble. But the reality of the answer is really that it depends on the specific functional area that we're talking about, and it also depends on the relevance of that functional area to the individual organization. So let's talk about when the ERP system is not a system of record. Actually, most custom development of an ERP system can be considered a system of differentiation, because that usually covers the unique processes to that organization. And an example would be one client that we have, which operates in international waters and moves between borders of different countries. They have a rather unique supply chain, and that means that they have unique processes for this. Now, you can, of course, have industry solutions, but you'll likely always require some customization, for example, regarding how you pay duties and how you move items between different companies and all these types of things. You could also imagine something like the second photo, so that would be RFID chips in the supply chain. I'm quite enamored with the RFID technology, and I think about how to implement such a technology more of like an Internet of Things style, where you might have RFID chips in your supply chain that need to be covered. That's not really system of record. And it's way more about unique processes and how to handle them. You could also imagine something like the last photo I have here, where this is supposed to be an overview of something covered by a camera. So you have computer vision making overview, and you get data from that. You could also think of another example, not on this slide, but business intelligence. So no, normally we wouldn't really think of it as a functional area necessarily, because we have specific systems for that, but the technology itself is very flexible, because we need it to be you can make new reports and so on in, for example, Power BI, where on a very short notice and things like that. So um, and it's very relevant, because you also there is this notion of ERP systems as data graveyards, because there is a lot of data that goes into an ERP system, but it's improving with new data science tools and creative ways to utilize this data. You can so you can think of this as an example of a system of innovation, if you want to. Another example of that would be low or no code apps, for example, Power Apps, that we'll also talk just a tiny bit about later. Now, what I mean to say by this is that applications are not stable in this pace layered model, and there can also be innovation cycles. So what I consider innovation right now could also be industry standard in the future, and then more of a system of differentiation and so on. So it's really about maintaining a dynamic view of what ERP is. Um, when parts of the system need to be stable and others do not, it's important that the system architecture reflects that, so that some of the systems run fast and are agile, while others are stable and secure. So we'll talk about that when we talk about implementations a bit later. And now just made that specific conclusion, but it's like a sub-conclusion. ERP systems really do need to be both stable and dynamic. This is also a model I won't delve into, but it's something that you can pause the video afterwards when you get it, and just have a closer look at it. It's quite useful. But let's talk about how do we do this. So now we've established this way of thinking about ERP. Let's try to switch gears now and talk about implementing ERP systems. How do you actually do it? Do you build it all from scratch? Probably not, but first of all, I want to talk about these all-in-one systems, or the application packages. This is what people usually mean when they say ERP, just so you're aware. Like when people say ERP system, they're probably referring to one of these standard systems, as you can see in this model here. I've organized this in two ways. First of all, in terms of the complexity, and in terms of the capability that increases with the size of the system. So you might have something that is a very simple accounting software, like you can even do it in Excel, or you might have Wave or another type of freemium solution for very small organizations. Then you have SME, small and medium-sized enterprises accounting software. Could think of FreshBooks or QuickBooks in Denmark. That would probably be something like Dineo, billing, economics, something like that. But then from there you get into small and medium-sized ERP software, which can do more than just the accounting, and that's where something like Business Central comes into play. You also have larger enterprise ERP software, which is a rather big group here, where we have the Microsoft Solution Finance and Operations, and we also have SAP and Oracle delivering solutions in this space. Now, what's relevant to say here is that there are entire industries built around single applications, and the bigger they are, the bulkier they are, but they also often do have quite incredible capabilities. And this list that I've just outlined is by no means exhaustive. In fact, I'm sure some people would consider some of the inclusions or exclusions a bit strange. So this is just to give you an idea of what's out there. And also, this is from an accounting perspective. You could have different functional areas that you would focus on, and then from there talk about what systems are available in increased complexity. But most take the accounting perspective, because every business needs accounting. Then I want to talk about a different type of ERP system where this is and probably not an entirely accurate term, because this is what I call it. I call it a service architecture, and it's not only referring to, but it's also covering microservices and service-oriented architectures. But what I really mean to do here is I want to switch the level of analysis from a single application to a suite of applications. And it's a bit special because all-in-one is sort of like a monolith application, but the alternative can be multiple applications rather than necessarily a microservice architecture. And that's exactly why it's relevant with the split that I made earlier between ERP systems as business systems and IT systems. So I hope you're starting to see now how we can support that conceptual idea with the actual system architectures. So the general idea behind these systems is that they are loosely coupled and they're encapsulated. So you have different applications talking to one another, and they're very characterized by these integrations. And you have also specific systems to handle specific parts of the ERP system landscape, for example, a warehouse management system or a CRM system, and these types of things. And they're two broad stroke ways to have such a service architecture. If you're not going for a microservice architecture, which you can certainly do, but it's a postmodern ERP. And now my connotations with the word postmodern is mostly from science, where it would be a bit like talking about social constructionists or something like that, but that's not really what it means in this case. It just means that you move the application into a broader perspective, with having one ERP system at the core, but then integrating to a lot of best of breed type of systems around it. So you still have this the ERP system. It's just not used for all of what it can do, and that's going to be very relevant when we talk about implementations a bit later as well. You also have the best of breed approach, and the only difference here is that you don't actually have an ERP system at the core. So, for example, you have a specific accounting system and a specific warehouse management system, and so on. They don't actually have any other capability than what they're supposed to do. Now, the main idea here is that it's about decoupling the functional area from the implementation of it. So I just want to talk now about these system architectures outline and how you can couple them to this pace layered application strategy, the model that I showed before. How do you reconcile these two concepts? Now, today, fewer and fewer areas of an ERP system could not be considered systems of differentiation or even systems of innovation, but for an application package, the one ERP system, most of what's standard is usually considered a system of record, robust, stable. But any extensions and customizations, in my opinion, are more of the system of differentiation. But it's you shouldn't just build anything custom. One client that we have actually used the ERP system to control the the entrance gate to their park, and I find that a bit funny. But that's probably a case where you would say, yeah, you could customize the solution to do that, but it's probably better to have that in a separate system. Like, yeah, you didn't pay your bills, so now you won't be let in. That's that's of course relevant, but a bit funny to include it in an ERP system. Now, you also could have systems of innovation in a standard ERP system, but that's quite rare and probably not too appropriate unless it's outside of the actual ERP application, like low-code apps or something like that. Okay, and then for the service architecture, this becomes way more complicated. How we connect that to the model depends very much on the functional area in relation to the organization. You can say that accounting is probably going to be a system of record still, but it really matters how important warehouse management, for example, is to your business processes and how customized they are and so on. But if you do build an extremely customized solution, then it's usually because you have very, very unique processes that need to be matched by the IT system, or that you have very unique capabilities to build such an integrated system. And by unique capabilities, I mean something like Facebook, for example. They have a tendency to build a lot of stuff themselves. I don't know what their ERP system they actually have, but you have a lot of very competent developers there, because this is a very costly way to go about it, and it requires competencies, and should really be integrated as part of the overall business strategy, or the business model even. Okay, so let's talk about implementing ERP system. I feel like we've built up this framework, both about how to think about ERP, and also how you have different types of architectures that you could implement. Let's talk about when it's relevant to do some of these. So um, first of all, it really depends on the business process needs. I've talked about this, but I'm just stressing it once again. You need to identify the critical functional areas for the organization's unique capabilities. And then you also have what I would call the diagonal view. And really what that means is just a fancy word for saying across time. It matters what phase the organization is in, what size it is, and what prospects it has for the future. And note implicitly here is also the idea that an ERP system needs constant development, because a healthy business constantly changes, and an ERP system needs to follow suit, or at least, well, maybe even lead the way in some cases. So you could consider, for example, a startup, a scale up, or a stable, small and medium-sized enterprise, a large organization, a public organization. It's very different what type of ERP system you would implement in this case, combined with the business process needs. That's so you might see that you have core needs for very specific manufacturing processes, then you might start out with a business central system right now, or something like that, because you can deal with the standard functionality for now, but you see that you want to move it out to a best of breed type of system later on. Now I've been I wouldn't say hating necessarily a bit on the standard systems, but it's mostly to contextualize when it's relevant to do each type of system, because they do have their place very much so. And often what you need is a mix of these architectures, and oftentimes also transitions are taking place between these systems. So a standard ERP system makes sense when because you get a big system that can do most of what you need in one integrated package. So a couple of advantages, just to mention a few, would be the low cost of getting it all. If you can live with the standard functionality, you get a lot of users, all your users working in a uniform system. You get a lot of existing add-ons and market-specific solutions. These types of things, the whole industry is built around extending these applications, and you also get just low key translations and GDPR and similar functionality already built in. You don't need to do that customly, and so on. And also, just one point, just because it is decoupled doesn't always make the functionality itself better. But what I would also say about implementing ERP systems is that an ERP standard system is particularly useful for master data management and accounting. And what I mean in terms of master data management is sort of the ERP as a single source of truth type of system. So you have your customers and vendors, items, whatnot in the ERP system, and then the other systems use that as the single source of truth. And it also leads you, it provides a good position for you to transition into more of a service architecture as the needs arise dynamically. So a heuristic that I would outline is that stick to standard when you can, but then apply more of like a postmodern ERP or best of breed approach when the phase size or business needs call for it. And another heuristic about the cost of these systems is that if you have a monolithic system, there's a very high cost of change, especially if you have a huge legacy ERP system. But then on the other hand, if you have a service architecture that's decoupled and integrated, you have a high cost of integration between the systems, and you can sort of optimize both by combining them based on the base layered model, right? So you have some very stable systems, and you have those talking to more of the other systems, and it's just something to think about, even though it's probably getting better as services and competences within implementing more of a microservice type of architecture are improving. That's definitely the trend we're seeing. Um, so something to keep in mind, and of course the existing systems in the organization are very relevant for what you should choose to keep the costs low, and while getting the functionality that you want and need. Now, I just want to say one thing: most ERP implementations fail to meet their objectives. I've read somewhere that it's about 55 to 75% of ERP implementations. I'm not sure about the validity of the source or the methodology used for this study, but it just gives you an idea that that there are big problems with implementing ERP. So I want to talk a bit about best practices, how to go about ERP implementations. So I call it a delivery organization. What I really mean is what type of organization can really provide ERP systems for a customer. And I like to distinguish between at least two types, which is first of all an ERP vendor, a traditional ERP vendor that provides a standard system with mostly standard add-on products, and then a few customizations. And then you can also think of an IT partner, which is more like Netcompany style of vendor, which can deliver very complex solutions spanning multiple technologies. We also deliver standard systems, but we can do more than that. And I think it's very relevant to match the customer needs and the delivery organization. So when you know what type of ERP system that you need, does your ERP vendor then match that? Because if the ERP partner needs to deliver a complex system, it can be very useful to have one IT partner doing all of it. So that comes in terms of project management and communication, all these types of things. People can be a huge drag on an implementation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you also have entire industries around very specific platforms, and you do need platform specialists. So you shouldn't really expect to just jump in and develop on an existing ERP platform if you don't know anything about it. And likewise, you also shouldn't expect platform specialists to be necessarily able to deliver a lot of functionality in technologies outside of the platform. So there's also that to consider. Now, the second point is about extensive analysis and requirement specification. So that's not very sexy to talk about, but it really is important, because you're touching the heart of the organization, and changing an IT system like that is something that you would rarely do, and then it's very important to also have the analysis reflect that. And once again, it's also, since it is mostly a system of record, that the governance should reflect that. That's kind of how we map this pace layer application strategy to how you specifically deliver an ERP system. So that also means, for example, that more of a waterfall type of development methodology is relevant, at least in terms of the extensive analysis of the business processes and these things, and the requirement specification before starting this the implementation. Now, it can of course be coupled with more agile development practices, but at least for the analysis part, it's going to be quite rare that you need to do this thorough analysis, and it really is worth it. And also, coming back to this pace layer model, I hope you can see sort of the connections between the framework and the implementation here. You should really adapt the methodology to the functional area of the ERP system and position it in the pace layered model here. So you might have a system or functional area that is way more of a system of differentiation, where you adapt the methodology to reflect that. For example, more of an agile or even Scrum approach to it. So another thing about the requirement specification is to include the context. That's extremely important. You can have user stories and so on, but it's very important to understand the context of why specific requirement is made, especially also because it's quite complex business logic, and you need to help the organization define their own requirements, because often they don't really know, and you might sometimes discover that what they write down in their requirements, or what they say they need, is not actually what they need, or you might have a different way of implementing it. So that's something to consider. Another thing to say is that you really cannot be an expert in all areas of an ERP system, because it just covers so much. So that is a somewhat unique property of ERP system, that you have more complex business logic than most system, at least in my opinion. So you also need people to specialize, and you will have a lot of collaboration between people with different knowledge on ERP implementations. And that's also why, in my opinion, ERP is really very interesting for both business people that are IT interested, because you can specialize in topics such as finance and accounting and supply chain management, or even change and training, as we'll talk about in just a second, or for business interested IT people, because you get to develop very complex business logic, and you also have platform specialists who can also deliver rather unique processes. It's quite fun to be involved in that entire process. I want to touch a bit more on change management, because this could really be a talk in itself, and not, if not to say multiple. Not unlike a lot of the other topics I've covered already, this is very much the broad strokes of ERP. But change management is often considered one of the most critical points of failure for ERP implementation. So a couple of notes about that. So first of all, you really need to manage customer expectations. The customer really needs to understand the complexity involved with implementing ERP systems, and so they can really prepare for the process. And it's important that the delivery organization takes responsibility for helping the customer understand that as well. Um, and also that they understand things like standard systems should preferably remain as standard as possible, due to the factors discussed earlier, because sometimes you see that customers realize, yeah, we have this standard system, but they want it to do this and this and this and this. But you should really keep the overall ERP strategy in mind, and evaluate if it still makes sense. Also, long-term cost-wise, upgrading such a system becomes more complicated the more customized it is. So as I said, core processes are what we're touching upon, that have often remained the same for a very long time. And just to imagine very specific scenarios, you have non-IT users that just need to do their everyday work, and implementing a new system really disrupts that. They're used to the shortcuts in the existing systems, and the specific platforms, and the naming, and all of these things. And sometimes you even get less capable systems, because if you have this hugely customized system, it might be a good idea to switch it out with something that is easier and less costly to maintain. So try telling one of the end users that they're getting a new system that can do less than what they're used to. That you really need to manage that in your change management processes. And another thing is that these ERP systems are quite complex, because they can do so much, but that means that users often need a lot of training for the specific areas of the system that they need to use. You'll see when we open up Business Central in a while that it can be a bit confusing if you're not used to the system. So you really need some training. I would also be remiss if I didn't talk about framing, because framing is really important. You need to frame the change process. What I mean by that is setting the stage for what the process is going to look like, and really care about how people make sense of the organization. Now we're getting into my sociology background, but I just want to mention it because it's really important that that you consider how you frame this entire process. And a couple of tools to deal with this is like stories. so you control the narrative of the implementation, what is being said about this story, or about this implementation, these things. And that can be very hard to control, especially when something goes sideways and people start becoming dissatisfied with how it's going. So that's something that you really need to consider carefully in the change management. Be very attentive to what stories are being said about it. And you can also do it in a positive way, like getting onboarding of users in the organization who tell good stories, say, yeah, this is going to be great, and we can see everything working out the way we want it to, or at least be very positive and engaged in the process. You can also have something like material framing, like actually showing them the system, the digital environment that they need to be working in, and being physically present with them, which is of course hard these days. But have sessions where you show this is what the system can do now, and then continuously monitor how they feel about that and so on. It's not like deliver a system and then start using it, right? It's more of a dynamic process. And then also leadership social framing, where you have these super users who take responsibility for the solution. Now, the second point here is also important. I'm saying be humble and curious, but what I could say instead of be humble is really don't be arrogant, because a lot of change management strategies set out as if they have all the answers, and now we deliver the system, and the organization should just follow suit. And if they don't do so, it's resistance to change, as they used to call it. I hate that framing. So talk about the resistance to change as more of insecurity or whatever else you need to do, but be compassionate and respecting for the end users and how it affects their life. And really involve them in the process. You need the top management, or as high management as possible, to be included in an ERP implementation to make critical decisions for sure. But you also need to understand that most knowledge is distributed in an organization, and it needs to be taken into consideration when you define new processes. So be curious as well about the organization's needs. I mentioned this a bit before as well, that most of the time the need is not really what it seems. The requirement is actually different from the implementation. So you can also go ahead and challenge some of the assumptions with your own ERP expertise, and lastly to adjust if it shows that there was something that wasn't considered right. So you can make adjustments during the implementation. Okay, once again, I think we should switch gears and move into Business Central. I'm talking, and now it's time to get a bit more specific. But I hope now that you see we have this. We have more of a framework. I'll just show you my face once again. We have a bit more of a framework to think about ERP. We have some thoughts about how to implement ERP in different scenarios, different customers, different architectures, and so on. So let's talk about specific implementations of ERP now. And we'll do that by using Business Central as an example, which is also what I know. So Business Central. So Business Central targets small and medium-sized enterprises. It can sometimes be used by bigger companies, but it's not quite as heavy duty as a system like finance and operations or something like that. And you can also really tell from the name Business Central that it attempts to solve a lot of the functional areas relevant for small and medium enterprises. It is the Business Central of the organization. It's built by Microsoft, and it's situated in the Microsoft Dynamics product portfolio, and that also means that it has quite easy and good integrations with other Dynamics products, but also the Microsoft Dataverse, which was previously known as the Microsoft Common Data Services or Microsoft Common Data Model. And it also has good integrations with other Microsoft products like the Power Platform, and really, if you think back to the service architectures, this is Microsoft's idea of implementing a postmodern ERP system in their own system landscape. Not that you're limited to using only Microsoft products, but you can think of Business Central as, yeah, you might get into the Business Central platform and later realize that you need more advanced capabilities in the world of CRM, and then take the dynamic CRM solution and integrate those these types of things. So when should you go for Business Central? If you're a small, medium-sized enterprise without many customizations, Business Central is a great option. But also, if you do have some customizations, but then you should probably try to keep them outside of the ERP system itself. And then you have larger enterprises that can also use it. But I would argue that it would be relevant to keep it mostly to an accounting service, or if you have functional areas that can be covered by the standard functionality, it could make sense. But try to keep it as more of a service type of thing when the organization gets larger. Um, yeah, another thing is that you have both on-prem and cloud solutions, but they're really moving to cloud. They want to be cloud native. It's an old system, I think, from the 80s, depending on which branch, because there has been a lot of mergers and a lot of uh, overtakings and different names and such. But what you have today and what Microsoft's vision really is a cloud native platform and a cross platform app suite. So you have it both in the web client, which we'll be using in just a second, but also for the smartphone and such things. The other recent change that has been to Business Central, as recent as in the last couple of years, is that you've moved to extensions. Previously, you could change the source code of the application itself, but now you have a standard app with the possibility to customize it via extensions without breaking the base app, and that should allow for easier upgrades, both the base app itself, but also more also the customized solutions, the extensions, and so on. And now it's one of the things that happened in this recent change is also that you have an increased incentive for source control, and you have more of a standardized development environment with more tools. Now, just one note about that is that some things were definitely easier in the previous development environment, but in my opinion, most things are better. And it's a work in progress for sure. Yeah, for sure. So what's really happened in the world of Business Central is that an entire community of both developers and consultants have been forced to change quite a bit in how they do things, and to quite honestly be a bit more disciplined about some things. And I think it's generally a quite healthy change, but it's not without its challenges. So Microsoft is still making changes. So they're refactoring the app for the cloud to actually reflect more of a service architecture within the app itself, and also to improve the development experience and the cloud experience at large. So it's a rather young cloud application. Development in Business Central, you have a specific application language, which is aptly named application language, or AL. And what I would say about this is that I like to say that's a bit like bowling with with bumper rails, those rails on the side of the bowling lane. I'm not sure my colleagues would like this bowling metaphor, but I'm really not saying that to neglect the competencies required to be an ERP developer. Quite the contrary. Actually, what I'm saying is that you need to have a deep understanding of very often complex business logic, and you need to be able to evaluate when functionality belongs in the ERP system and when it does not. So really, what I mean by this bowling metaphor is that there are some limitations in the programming language, but that's mostly to keep the system of record safe. Now, it is also a dynamic language, and new features are continuously added, making the development experience smoother and more advanced, so we can do more stuff. But I really like this quote that if it's not easy to do in AL, it probably doesn't belong in AL. Or probably some MVP, Microsoft MVP, like Eric Wouters or Luc van Vocht or someone like that who said it. Sorry if that I'm not providing the right credit, but it's a very good quote, and it really demonstrates this idea of the postmodern ERP, or this service architecture. So do some customizations in Business Central, but also move a lot of it outside of the platform. So another thing is that we've moved to Visual Studio Code. That's where you develop Business Central extensions now. And you use Docker containers for development, which is quite useful for having different versions of Business Central. If you have different clients and so on, then you can develop it to these specific versions and control it via Docker containers, and there are lots of other benefits as well. So getting some more modern tools is very nice and needed in the world of Business Central. Okay, so let's talk about control add-ins. Now, this is now we're really getting into the nitty-gritty, and this is the specific technology that I want to demonstrate today. And what control add-ins are is it's really UI controls. So what you can use them for is mostly to change the user interface of Business Central or make something nicer. As I mentioned before, it's sometimes a bit difficult to use and a complex ERP system, but control add-ins can be a way to make the UI just a bit better and a bit easier for the end user. Now, just to provide some context for this technology, the extensions of in Business Central are usually systems of differentiation, so it should be minimized when it's not a critical business process that you're talking about, and it should be well thought through and implemented. And control add-ins are mostly for UI purposes, in my opinion, but it's probably not the go-to solution for everything. Also, the control add-ins, it really enables you to do web development in Business Central. It's using JavaScript, so you can use all the known frameworks like React and Angular and Vue, and use pretty cool tools like Gulp and Babel, things like that. I've even wondered if you can use Flutter and Dart. That would be quite interesting to make an implementation like that. And control add-ins are very useful if your team has web development skills, but also it can be a bit hard to maintain for Business Central only developers, because they're probably not used to the JavaScript syntax and the best practices on how to build JavaScript. So what I would also say about control add-ins is try to keep the business logic in Business Central if at all possible, because it does provide a cleaner structure and focuses the control add-ins on the UI. That's like a rule of thumb I'm very happy to get input on that as well, because there could be use cases that are different. But that's at least my opinion. Okay, so let's move to demo. Now I think I have a rather funny little image here. So this is a very old school meme. I don't know if anyone else remembers it, but what I'm actually going to demonstrate is a live stream that I've built into Business Central. So I've put a live stream in your live stream. So I'm going to pull up Business Central to the screen now. So what you can see here is the role center, and you can consider this like the home page of Business Central. This is where you're going to spend most of your work. Oops, I need to keep this one open. So this is where you're going to keep where you're going to have the overview of what you do every day. You see, this is the business manager role center, so you'll see that you have an overview of the business in large numbers and these things. I've implemented this live stream here, so you can imagine, I don't know if there's a specific use case for it. It's mostly to demonstrate the technology, but you could imagine that you want an overview of your warehouse or your shop or the receipt area or something like that, and then you can have this overview directly on the main screen of your ERP system. What we're looking at here is actually a live stream of an eagle's nest from somewhere in California, I believe, which I think is pretty cool. And you can probably tell from the controls that you see here that it's simply just YouTube that I'm using. So let's just explore this functionality a bit, and then we can dive into the code afterwards. So I'll just go to my setup here, which I find here, and you'll see here I have the live stream URL, and I'm forced to follow this particular pattern. And if I wanted to change this, I could definitely do so. So if I change it here. I just copy it over, and then if I say that I don't want it to autoplay, then I want to show the controls. I want to keep it muted for the sake of this live stream, but then I also don't want to allow full screen. Then I say okay to that, and then I'll update my role center here. Now this should be reflected in this live stream here. So you'll see I have my controls. It didn't start automatically, and then when I say play, then it starts. Now this is a shout out to my colleague Johan. This is actually no, it's not Mordor. It is an active volcano on Iceland. So it's a pretty cool live stream in my opinion. One other thing I would say is that let's try to perhaps break the system a bit to see if we can do that. Might very well be possible. This is just a demo, but let's try first of all to delete the URL. We could say hello here, then I'll get an error here saying you must provide a valid URL. If I make it blank, I'm allowed to. I don't want any live stream, and then let's change something around here. I say I don't want it to be muted, then I cannot autoplay these things. So okay, let's go back and let's try to update the role center once more. And now you'll see, sorry, the page could not be found. I don't know if you noticed, but just before this loaded, there was a blue screen. And actually what's cool about that is it's the exact same color here. So there's a style guide that Business Central or Microsoft provides for the system. So you can align your CSS style to your custom control add-ins here. So that is mostly the demo. I want to show you just one thing that I wanted. I planned on making this ready for the demo, but I didn't quite manage to find the time to build finish it up. But just to give you a bit of a hint on what could be possible to build with these UI controls. So in here on a vendor, I've set up this this map here, which shows Copenhagen right now. This is where I'm sitting right here in our offices, and it's directly in the system, and it's you can move the map around. It's dynamic like that. And this is actually the standard function where if you say show on map and I say okay, then it actually opens up Bing Map. It is a Microsoft product after all, but who would want to to do that? So this is just a pretty cool implementation. You can use a lot of different APIs and then integrate them directly into the system. Now this is would normally take in the address that is here on the vendor, but I've just hard coded the address of Netcompany's main office here. So but just wanted to show you some of the possibilities with control add-ins. So now let's have a look at the code. So I'll pull up Visual Studio Code here, and you see I have a workspace out here called Tech Talk, and it's also has a folder called Unpacking ERP. And yeah, actually, let's talk just a tiny bit about the workspace. You can do some really nice settings in here, and let me know if you can't see the text in here. I increased the size of it, so it should be easier. But if it's not, then please let me know so I can make it visible. But you can do some cool things in here. For example, recommend. So when a new developer joins the team, they'll automatically get the recommended extensions. So just click a button, then they have the extensions needed to start development, and then you can set up some generic rules for the workspace that apply to all of the development team. So let's dig into some of the code behind this live stream I built. So first of all, you have a control add-in object, and this has some height properties, and then you also refer to the scripts that you want to use. Then you have some events, and then you have a procedure, and this is a simplification, so take it with a grain of salt, but the way you can think of is that events are what's called in Business Central by JavaScript, so JavaScript calling AL code, and then procedures can be considered AL code calling JavaScript. And then we have this setup. So this is actually most of Business Central development will be tables and pages and code units and these types of things. So this is a very common scenario that you would have a setup table following a pattern where you have only one instance of it, which is what we ensure with this singleton pattern right here. And then you have different fields, so it's quite easy to develop tables in Business Central and have some different ways to show them in the in the client. And then you have similarly a page that actually is a UI control of sorts that displays the content of the table. Then you have the role center where you just simply add in this live stream page part, card part is what it's called. And then you have the JavaScript here. So you have the style, which is really quite simple. You have a start, which is just saying yes, now the control add-in is ready. And then you have a live stream, which is some main code, and it's probably quite ugly, so don't judge. But I initialize it here, saying now I'm building up the skeleton for the add-in, and then I actually immediately invoke AL, saying now I actually want to start the live stream functionality here. And then this is quite low level way to call it, but yeah, there are some really good sources out there. I'll talk about that in when we round off this presentation. And then lastly, we have this invoke result function down here, which is actually what adds the live stream to the control add-in. And this one is called in my page here, where I actually now you have a bit of an anti-pattern here, having business logic on a page. But for the demo purposes, I'll just explain that first I get my live stream setup, and then I define the parameters that I want to pass to JavaScript from this setup. I have built this JSON object, and then I pass it on this uninvoke result, as we saw in the control add-in here. So you see in JavaScript we had these functions, and we have this one in AL code. Okay, so that covers the demo that I wanted to show. So let's go back to the presentation. Now, first of all, I just want to talk a bit about some of the improvements that you could make to this demo. That you could don't worry, none of this is in production, but you could increase, first of all, the readability of the code. You could make it more asynchronous. You could do inversion of control to allow for decoupling and testability. Yeah, here are the slides that I prepared if my demo wasn't working. So let's just skip past those. So see if I manage to do that. Here we go. All right. So further investigation on what I've been talking about today. If you want to learn more about this application, page layout application strategy, there are some good links here. You can pause the video and find them. And for control add-in development, I've created this repository, so you can go and play around with the code if you want to. You will need to do some Business Central setup to start the development. Let me know if you run into any trouble with setting it up. I'd be happy to help. Here's a link to the style guide that I mentioned before. And then the go-to guy on control add-in development is in Business Central is Vjekoslav Babic, or also known as just Vjeko. I think he's from Croatia. He has a YouTube channel called Vjeko Live, which has some really good content. And he also has a blog, vjeko.com, and he has a really good specific tech talk on YouTube called Control Add-in Development Supercharge, which is from one of the big conferences on Business Central development. But yeah, that is what I had for you today. So I hope you've learned something. Try to take you through, as I said, all the way the top level, broad strokes of everything, way down into the very nitty gritty stuff.